Hi, everyone. Nice to be here. Thank you very much for the invite. I'm pretty excited to talk to you guys. As I'm not a paranormal researcher. I'm a like serious academic, although I hate serious academia. It's a terrible system. Don't go into academia. Um, but I came across this article by Dr. Wehrman, and I thought it was fascinating. And I thought, hey, you know what? I've got to see for myself. I gotta try this out. Um, yeah. So. My name is Jordan Wehrman. I'm from University of Sydney and Macquarie University. I did my PhD in time perception, the perception of like illusions of time. And it sounds very fancy. People get very excited, like, oh, how does time work? You know, uh, is it the entropy in the brain and things like that? This stuff I was actually studying was very basic. So what I would do is I would show you guys a circle like this, and I'd show that for 1 second, and then I'd show a circle like this. And that would be for 1 second. I'd say, hey, which one of these two circles lasted longer? And generally, you'd believe that this circle lasted longer because it was bigger. So there's this amalgamation of time and space in our brain. And that was kind of the area that I kind of fell into my research. And then I went on to study consciousness at University of Sydney, which I'll talk about in a minute. But before I get too far into it, I want to say thank you, yes, for having me. Thank you for the first talk. That was fantastic. You're a very inspiring speaker. I thought that was great. Thank you to the Cardigan Fund. So I did my research. The research I'm going to talk about was with the Cardigan Fund. They did. It was very helpful. So Lance Storm over the back. I sent him an email and I was like, hey, look, I did these 2 studies initially, and I would like to do some more parapsychology research on retrospective or retrocausal cueing. It was really to me, it's a testament to parapsychology, right? So if you guys are into this field, and you probably know more about parapsychology than I do, you probably come across the feelings of, oh, these guys they're just making things up and they're just choosing their studies and things like that. And I think that is, sorry, I have bad language a little bit. Sorry. But I think that's bullshit. That's nonsense. My first study, I found I had 2 studies. They both came back with null effects. I sent this to Lance and I said, hey, I found a null effect. I would like to study this some more. And he said, hey, you know what? Sure, let's do this. Let's continue to study this, even though I found a null effect. Do you know how hard it is in genuine academia to get funding for finding a null effect? It's impossible. It's absolutely impossible. The fact that I could get funding from the Cardigan Fund and the AIPR, is that right? Yes, yeah, it's the AIPR to do further studies on this. I don't know. I think that's a really big testament to the integrity and the authenticity that you guys bring to these studies. So that's really good. Yeah. So and I guess one other side note about me coming here today, I've told my professor that I'm here. So I'm a postdoctoral researcher, and I told him, I was like, hey, I'm going to go talk at this parapsychology researcher or at this parapsychology conference. And you can imagine his response of, hey, that's fine. If you want to throw your career away, that's up to you. So, that's kind of the attitude often taken to this kind of research. And I will say, I've read a bit of parapsychology research, and I couldn't always make sense of it myself, like the methods used. I come from a very like stereotypical background of like doing things like this, where something would appear on the screen and something else would appear on the screen. I'm like, hey, which one was which? Just super basic, super simple stuff, right? And but I've taken that kind of approach to doing parapsychology research, doing very basic, very simple stuff. So this is not going to be fascinating. I don't have any amazing stories of past experiences and things like that to share with you, but I do bring very, I guess, just real hard scientific rigor. I'm like, no, I'm going to do it this way, and it's going to be really, really controlled and everything like this, really tight, controlled experiments. Yeah. So, my background, yeah. So as I said, I did my PhD in cognitive neuroscience. I'm currently working at UCID and postdoctoral researcher in consciousness. So what we do is I give people, like right now we're giving people, it's called dexmedetomidine. It's an anesthetic drug to remove or reduce levels of consciousness of people. And then we're doing stimulation to try to adjust their level of consciousness. So it hopefully will have applications in anesthetics. So if you ever need a surgery, maybe we can hopefully give you less drugs and kind of adjust your conscious level that way. One quick note I wanted to say, you mentioned consciousness and that you couldn't find consciousness at a specific location in the brain. That really resonated with me. I think that's entirely accurate. There's a number of theories of consciousness, but one of the ones that I really like is something called embodied cognition or embodied consciousness. I don't know if anybody's heard of embodied cognition. Yeah. So I personally think that's a very accurate portrayal of consciousness, that we're not just conscious with our brain, like you were saying, right? We need the body and the extension of that, of society. Like I don't think we're individuals as such. And so, what you're talking about with the ocean and the iceberg metaphor, I think is very, very plausible to me. Yeah. And yeah, so I think the reason I got this job doing research in consciousness was because I think without an appreciation of time or an appreciation of when is now, when is the future, where we are situated in time, I don't think we could be conscious, right? So if I didn't have any sense of duration, any sense of existence, I wouldn't have any sense of myself, any sense of consciousness, right? So what is retrocausation? Retrocausation is the idea that the future can affect the present. Now, I will say, we got some younger audience members here. So if you want to get a good grade in an exam, like we were saying, yes, it might help to study afterwards, but also study beforehand. Don't just rely on retrocausation. There will be a relatively small effect. But and if you were going to do that, so at least the way I ran my studies was I wouldn't look at any data until I'd finished collecting everything, right? So if you want to get a better mark by studying after the exam, for example, then make sure you do that before you already get the marks back. Yeah. So don't just wait till you get the marks and you're like, oh no, I should have studied harder and then study, right? Nothing will change there. Yeah. So retrocausation. So the metaphor that you often see is that you have like a rock here, right? And we have this stream of consciousness, and here's like our yeah. So the stream represents our conscious experience, right? And then ahead of an event, you get this eddy, right? And that's kind of like our conscious experience of a future event. This future event is affecting our present, right? Does that metaphor make sense to you guys? Not quite. Okay, I'll try again. It is a little bit complicated, right? So generally, you can imagine that we have a stream of consciousness. Just where we're running through life, where we're living our life, we're existing, right? Now you can imagine if there was an actual stream, if our consciousness was actually water flowing, yeah, and then you had your finger and you put your finger in that stream, right? Then before that where that finger is, yeah, in time, there will be a small effect of that stimulus. There'll be a small event prior to that stimulus that informs you that that stimulus is about to happen, right? So retrocausation, it's been applied, or it's been theorized in quantum physics. And again, I'm not a physicist. Actually, in the paper I wrote, the first one I wrote, I mentioned entropy and I meant enthalpy, which is just super embarrassing to me when I found out. I was like, oh, what have I done? But the idea, it's a way of solving the spooky action at a distance. If you guys are familiar with that, right? So it's where you can entangle two particles. You can take two particles and you can entangle them. So make them kind of, I guess, I don't know, work together, right? And then you can separate them by an infinite amount of space. And then by looking at one particle, you can automatically determine what the other particle, what state the other particle is in. Yeah, normally they talk about spin, right? So if one particle is spinning like this, then another particle will be spinning like this, right? So because of conservation of momentum or something like this. I might be totally mangling the physics explanation, right? And one explanation of that from physics is that information, that kind of information, can travel infinitely fast. And people are like, well, that could break the speed limit, the speed of light. It could go faster than the speed of light. That seems not realistic, right? So an alternative explanation of that is retrocausation. The idea that by determining the spin of one atom, you are retrocausally determining the spin of the other atom. You are taking the information that you had now, and it's transferring that information into the past. Yeah, so it's determining retrocausally the spin of the other atom. Does that make sense? Yeah, seeing some nods. Okay, good. So it's also proposed to underlie things like precognition or I mean, it could even be proposed to underlie things like gut feelings, right? So like I have a, if you're ever walking down an alley and you have a gut feeling of something happening and then something happens, right? That could be an example of it. Rather than being precognitive, you're not necessarily predicting what is going to happen. It's that something is going to happen and therefore you have those feelings. Yeah. So that would be a reversal of the normal way that we would think about precognition, right? And I mean, I'm totally open to either way being the case, but either way, I don't know. I think we've all probably had experiences kind of like that, right? So yeah, I mean, look, our first speaker kind of went into his history a little bit. I should tell you, like, my history. I was brought up as a Baha'i, if anybody knows about the Baha'is. And I guess the Baha'is are relatively open to this kind of thing. So, like in the Baha'i faith, they talk about the possibility of like paranormal existences, and they talk about life forms on other planets and things like that being a possibility, right? So I was brought up fairly open to this kind of idea, yeah. And then when I lived in Thailand when I was about 19 or 20, and I had my own kind of a paranormal experience with I guess a ghost, for lack of better words, right? It never really affected me particularly much. I never really had much kind of faith in my own experience, right? But then, as I got older, I came across some research, and then because the research was very like hard and scientific, it very much appealed to me, being a scientist, right? So what happened was I came across some research by Bierman and Beal, I think is how you say it. It was a reaction time task, and that's the kind of stuff I do. So what would happen is they would get people in, and they would have two sets of, what was that? Oh, good. Yeah, they'd have two sets of stimuli, right? So you have stimulus like this that are like circles, and one that are spiky, and they'd ask you to react. Push A if you see the circles, and push B if you see the spikes, right? And so after you've done this task, you can imagine that normally the reaction times would be about the same, right? Whichever stimulus you see, you just react, right? And then after they've done this, without looking at the results of this first experiment, they'd have people do a second experiment, right? And in this second experiment, what you do is you get the people to do something called a go, no-go task. And the go, no-go task, what happens is when you see these stimuli, you go, you respond. And when you see these stimuli, you stop. Yeah, you don't respond to them, right? And so in general, if you reverse the order of this, so if I do this task and then this task, my reaction times to these four stimuli will be faster than my reaction times to these four stimuli. Yeah. So these stimulus, I'll respond to quicker than these stimulus. And the reason is it's fairly basic, right? It's fairly intuitive that here you've practiced responding, and here you've practiced not responding. So when you get these stimuli, you respond or you don't respond. You're used to that, right? Yeah. But what they did is by reversing the order of them, they showed the same effects. Now, was it as big? No, it wasn't as big. Of course not, right? But it was still there. Yeah. And there was no way that, in at least classical cognitive neuroscience, there's no way that the task that you were about to do could affect your reaction times in the first task, right? So the idea being that, well, what was happening there was a retrocausal influence. You were having the effect of the second task affecting the first task. Now, before I go on, does that make sense to you guys? Because I mean, the cognitive neuroscience is it's a hard thing. It's a sticky subject to get your head around. But does that make sense? Like how that task works? No, not yet. That's all right. We'll try again. We'll try again. So here's this is how I've actually done it. When I did my we had to do a 3-minute thesis, and I actually got disqualified because I'm not allowed to use props. But I'm going to use props anyways. When I show you guys a microphone, I want you guys to put up your right hand, and when I show you my shoe, I'm sorry, taking off my shoe, I want you to put up your left hand. All right. So if I go like this, you go huh, right hand, nice, perfect. And I go huh, nice, right, and I go huh. Oh, you guys are really good. You guys are really good at this. Now, I'm going to do a go, no-go task, right? So when I show you the microphone, I want you to put up your hand. And when I show you my shoe, I don't want you to do anything, right? Yeah. Yeah. Good. We got somebody, and we always trick some people, right? So that's the go no go task, right? Now, the next set of tasks I'm going to do is going to be a queuing task. And so I'll show you the queuing task now while I have my shoe off, and then I'll put it back on because I don't want to, make this an unlivable area, right? So what the queuing task would be like is, for example, a B task. So like push A, push B. I'll be like, hey, I'm going to show you the microphone. Push. And you guys respond really quick, right? I'm going to show you my shoe, and you respond really quick. Microphone, shoe, microphone, shoe, shoe. Oh, I lied to you. Why would I lie to you? That's so mean, right? But that's how this task works, right? The queuing task, by sometimes telling you the truth and sometimes telling you the lie, we can alter your reaction times, right? So if I tell you what's about to happen, and 80% of the time it's true, then you'll respond faster than when that thing happens, right? But if I lie to you, your reaction times are much slower, yeah? Or you're more likely to get the answer wrong. So here in the Wehrman task, and yeah, hold on to the queuing task because that's kind of the stuff I did. But in the Wehrman task, he did that go no go task, right? After doing this standard reaction time task, and he showed that in this standard reaction time task, which he did first, the reaction times to the stimuli that you'd practice responding to were faster than the reaction times to the stimuli you have practiced inhibiting your response to, right? So that, I mean, that was a really cool finding. I was somewhat skeptical of it. I was like, oh, this is wild. But I mean, and I think this is important to note, right? That when you go to academia, so I took this to my professor. I was like, oh, this is wild, right? What do you think of this? And he was like, oh yeah, I mean, that's really cool. They probably made up their data. What? That's bullshit. That's nonsense. Why would you possibly think that they made up their data? We have, if you guys are familiar with cognitive science in general, we have this the replication crisis. Have you heard of the replication crisis? Yeah, that's because all of our science, even the standard parasite or standard psychology stuff, is not that great. Like, I'll be honest, man, some of the research we do is not that great. It's not that robust. We don't have the power. We don't have the statistical kind of not integrity. Like, I think most of our studies are fairly like they have high integrity. And I would say that I believe this because I believe in scientists, right? I do genuinely believe that when a scientist says something, they're not lying. They're not making up their data. But then I guess not every scientist is the same. So some scientists don't believe that, right? So yeah, so after seeing this study, because I'd never heard of the BEM studies. Have you guys heard of the Daryl BEM? I'm sure there's a few head nods here, right? I got more into it, and I was like, oh, well, I have to read this this study, and I read some criticisms of it, like the file drawer effect. So the file drawer effect is when negative studies or null studies aren't published. So that was one reason that I really pushed when I did my own studies to publish null results because, after having the results myself, I believe my findings and I believe what I found. But I think it's also important to publish negative results because that's how you grow knowledge, right? Like, for now, if you guys all wanted to go out and do your own queuing studies, which I wouldn't advise doing, they're incredibly boring, you would have a better idea of what works and what doesn't work, right? Which is important. That's how science grows. Yeah. And then the other was the Bayesian reasoning kind of, or the Bayesian statistics approach. Have you guys heard of Bayesian statistics? A little bit. So Bayesian statistics is basically that you have a prior belief. So you have a likelihood of the things that'll happen, right? So you can imagine it being something like this, right? Where you have, this is like, I don't know, our belief scale of some kind. And we have our prior, which is like this, right? And our prior looks like this to say that this is what we think will happen. This is the possibility of things that'll happen, right? Now, after that, you get some evidence, you collect evidence, right? And so maybe your evidence looks like this, right? And then from combining those two pieces of information, your prior set of beliefs and the evidence you get, you adjust your beliefs into a posterior estimate of what's possible. And in this case, your posterior would look like this, right? You get something maybe a little bit flatter, but it would look like this, right? Now, the Bayesian argument against the BEM studies or the against psychic events or parapsychology in general is that yes is that the is that we're using the wrong priors to assess this. So the way like the statistics are normally done would be you have a flat prior, which would mean that anything is possible. So when I get evidence, then my prior will shape, or my posterior will shape that evidence, right? And in particular, Wagenmaker or Wagenmeyer or something like that, this person who made this critique of the BEM studies, what he did was he said, well, you know what? We all know that parapsychology is nonsense, right? It's bunk. It's total absolute trash. So, you know what our prior should look like is this, right? And by having a prior like this, it doesn't matter how much evidence you get. You could get all the evidence in the world. I'm trying not to overwrite your your email here. You get all the evidence in the world, and your posterior only shifts like this, right? So he's saying, oh, we shouldn't change our beliefs based on any amount of evidence. And that, I don't know. I mean, as a scientist, that sounds pretty nonsense, right? That sounds pretty whack, right? So, yeah, so his idea is, his argument is that, oh, well, if I was going to believe parapsychology, then the amount of evidence that I would need to believe that would have to be outrageous. It would have to be wild. It would have to be, one of my friends described it as like an X-Man coming in and doing like Magneto stuff, right? And I'm like, well, that's not really fair, is it? Like, we believe all kinds of nonsense all the time, with so maybe we should have a little bit more relaxed priors in regard to this type of study. Yeah. But I will say, when I did read the BEM study, it seemed a lot of the experiments were very like, I guess, wild to me, because I came from a very like strict cognitive science background. He was using things like illicit images, as I recall. It's been a while since I've looked at the study, but he'd use fairly evocative things, and you could argue that that is what's needed to get this retrocausal effect. But I said, hey, no, I want to look at this from a very boring perspective. I want to see if everyday people can do this, and I want to see if they can do it even online, right? So I ran a bunch of experiments on this. So the basic idea of what I did was, instead of where I had two different tasks, I would do a queuing paradigm. So instead of queuing you as to what I was about to do, like I did before, where I'd say microphone or I'd say shoe, I would go this, and then afterwards I'd say microphone, right? And the idea is, if there is a retrocausal influence, then your action times when I said microphone after versus when I said shoe after should be different, right? And you can do this on a lot of different paradigms. You can do this on space. So I could say left or right. I could do this on a go, no go task. I could say go or no go prior to the stimulus or after. I could do this with like what would happen or when things would happen. If it's going to happen after I start a trial like this, it could happen after a short amount of time or after a long amount of time. All these things are cueable because our brains are very good at learning, right? We're very good at taking information and using it, right? And so all I did was I reversed this order. I said, hey, I'm going to show you the cue after the imperative, not the other way around. So the cue is telling you what's about to happen. The imperative shows you how to respond, right? And so, yeah, so this is what it looks like. And shown another way, this is from figure one of my first journal article. So we show you it's called a fixation cross. Then we show you a letter to respond to. Yeah. And then we have your reaction times. And then we had another letter to respond. Then we had, sorry, the cue, right? So in this case, they don't match. So your reaction time should be longer than the other way around. If I had the letter A here. Yeah, is that so far so good? It's kind of making sense. Hopefully the shoe metaphor helps, right? Now, oh, okay, yeah, I'll show this one first. So these are from Lance and I's study. So we found no effect of cueing when we we cued you whether something would happen or when something would happen, right? So when something would happen would be me saying, hey, after a long time or a short time after the start of this trial, nothing is going to happen. Or sorry, you're going to respond at this time, right? We didn't find an effect of that. You can see this, right, by the fact that these two lines are parallel here. Nope. this one, sorry, that these two lines are parallel, right, in the retrocausal condition. Yeah. And then when we used standard condition, you can see that your reaction times were longer when we told you, sorry, your reaction times were longer when we lied to you. Yeah. So when we had an invalid cue, your reaction times were longer. Now, in a biased condition, again, when in this case, we would bias you by the majority of the time, we'd say, hey, shoe after a short amount of time. And then after a long amount of time, we'd show microphone, right? Then you get this kind of effect where when the expectations matched reality, then your reaction times were further apart if you had the biased versus unbiased condition. Yeah. And then closer together when you had a mismatch. Whereas in the retrocausal condition, they were again parallel. So look, if you're not used to looking at these kind of graphs, it's very difficult to look at. But what you can see is basically parallel, parallel, change, change, right? And that's kind of the main takeaway, right? So this is the standard condition where I'd cue beforehand. This is the retrocausal condition where I'd cue afterwards, right? Same with a go, no go. So this is where I would say go to a microphone and say, and don't respond to a shoe. And in this case, again, they're fairly parallel. Now, you could say, hey, maybe there's a small effect here, but statistically, it didn't come out. Yeah. And I think that's really important, at least to me, because I deal in statistics all the time. As a kind of a tangent, right now I'm in an argument with my professor at university because he can see a bump in some of the EEG that we have. So EEG is it's called electroencephalograph, and it's like electrodes on the head to measure something, right? And he can see this little bump that's different between two conditions. And he's like, oh, it's there. You got to find it. I'm like, well, it's not there because it's not there statistically. And then we go back and forth, back and forth, and back and forth about this. And he wants me to reprocess the data, which is, kind of what mainstream academia accuses parapsychology of doing. So, which I find kind of ironic. But yeah, so it wasn't there statistically. So in my mind, it's not there, right? At least at the power I had, the number of participants I had. Whereas in the standard condition, again, you can see the lines diverge, right? Now, the same was true when I cued where something would happen. So what I would do is I would show you an arrow and then a box, right? And this is the standard condition, yeah? Or I'd show you a box and then an arrow, and this is the retrocausal condition. Or I would show you a flash, and that flash would grab your attention. And in the standard condition, you'd see again an effect. In the retrocausal condition, you don't find an effect, right? This is from my first paper on the topic, and across all the retrocausal conditions, I didn't find a statistical effect, right? In the current paper, I did a masked version of this. So in this case, I would show you a mask that looks like this, and then a cue, and then a mask. And this cue is about 30 milliseconds long. So it's really short. And I wanted to see, hey, maybe I didn't find an effect here because the signals were too conscious. I want to see if maybe the unconscious signals could affect, retrocausal cueing, right? And again, I didn't find an effect. In the standard condition where I'd show the cue first, you can see that there's this big divergence of the two lines. Whereas in the retrocausal conditions, they were pretty much parallel. Yeah. But where I did find an effect was in the cueing what would happen. Now, before I talk about this, I will say, if you guys ever have a gut feeling that something's going to happen, do you guys have a gut feeling about what is going to happen? Or do you have a gut feeling about whether something is going to happen, or when it's going to happen, or where it's going to happen? For me, at least, it's normally that I have this gut instinct about what is about to happen, right? Like, oh, I don't know. For example, I'm about to, I don't know, trip on a stone or something like that. Whatever it is, it doesn't matter, right? The idea is I have a gut instinct of what is going to happen, not when it's going to happen, not where it's going to happen, and not whether it's going to happen, right? If I had a weather experience, like the go, no go, then I didn't have an experience at all, right? So intuitively, at least to my mind, this particular rendition of the experiment, where in this case it's like the microphone shoe experiment, right? I'm going to show you a shoe, or I'm going to show you a microphone. It makes sense that would show a retrocausal condition if anything is going to. And it's also kind of similar to, so originally I wanted to do a no-go or go-no-go task because that's what Wehrman had did, right? Here. But when I thought about it, it's like, well, actually, what he found the retrocausal effect in is choice of what is going to happen, right? This is where he found the retrocausal effect. This was causing it, right? So if this is where you're going to find the retrocausal effect, well, this is where you found a retrocausal effect, right? So in terms of, I'll start with accuracy. You don't really see an effect in the retrocausal condition, these two, and you don't see an effect in the standard condition, right? At least between the sides of the hands, right? And you do see this effect here, right? So what I did, so this is a slightly different than, so are you guys familiar with pre-registration? So if you want to get something published, you should technically pre-register with a journal or some kind of database to say, hey, this is the study that I'm going to do, right? Now, no standard scientists do this ever. I don't think I've ever published a pre-registered study other than this one, right? And it's, I guess, another example of parapsychology being held to a higher standard than what would be required for normal psychologists, right? So in the pre-registration, I wanted to see if there was going to be this effect of weather, right? If there was going to be the effect of cueing on microphone or shoe, right? Retrospectively, I thought, hey, you know what? There might be a side advantage. There might be that my left hand or my right hand responds faster, right? So in the first instance, I checked that and I made it very clear that this is a post hoc analysis. So this is a analysis after I've already done the first analysis. I'm like, hey, this would have been a good idea. And I found that well, it's probably easier to see over here. In the right in the valid condition, right? My reaction times were faster in my right hand compared to my left hand. I have to double check the things here, right? But in my right hand, my reaction times were, and was statistically significant, were slower to an invalid cue than a valid cue. And that's exactly the effect you would expect, right? That's exactly the same effect that you see in the standard like version of the paradigm, which is here, right? Now, I guess the other kind of thing to note, right, is that in the right hand, or sorry, in the left hand, you don't see the same effect, right? And this is actually kind of interesting. I was thinking about what you were talking about with using automatic writing and doing, talking to your right, or talking to your left hand through talking to your right hand, that kind of thing, right? So I would be interested in your kind of interpretation of this, I guess, that so the retrocausal condition was found the retrocausal condition was found in the right hand and the opposite was found in the left hand. When you look at the standard condition, the effect is there in both hands, but in the left hand it's smaller. So it's almost like you took this angle here and in the retrocausal condition you kept shifting it for invalid cueing, right? Now, this is a post hoc analysis, so people in the mainstream academia would be like, oh, well, it's not really there. So what I did was I took that exact same experiment and I ran it again. I did it on another 50 people. This was online at home. They could have been watching Netflix. I don't know. But the exact same effect occurred there. In fact, it was slightly larger in the second set of experiments, right? So this I took as evidence that retrocausation, it's a phenomenon. It's a thing that is there. I've done this experiment twice. I've replicated the effects. Like, I mean, what's the argument? I actually brought this up with another professor friend of mine, and he said, "Oh, that's really cool. That's really weird. It'd be cool if you did it another time." I'm like, what do you mean? Like, you guys do experiments once, and you think this is the bee's knees, right? So he wants me to do it a third, a fourth, a fifth time. I don't know how many times I'd have to do it in order for him to believe it, but I mean, I think it's kind of there, right? So so far, I guess to get a kind of a head count or something, do the methods that I've used make sense? Because I know this is not a cognitive science kind of group necessarily. Is it? Yeah. Any questions about how to? No. Any questions about how I ran these experiments? Yeah. This is actually a good question, right? So I did use the ASGR. Did I get that right, Lance? The Australian Sheep Goat Scale, ASGS. Sorry, yeah, the Australian Sheep Goat Scale, and that differentiates sheep from goats. And I can never remember which way around they are. So sheep are the people who believe in parapsychology, and Okay, so they have you use this questionnaire to get the level of belief in parapsychology or like reality, I guess, right? Um, However, I didn't find any really strong repeated correlations in these studies with the ASGS, sorry. Yeah. So, but I mean, to me, that's actually fairly interesting, right? Because this was just a bunch of university students. This was like a bunch of, I think it was 50 in each experiment, just online. Yeah. Well, so no, yeah, I didn't tell them they were doing an ESP experiment because I did what's that? No, yeah, they were, yeah. So this is like, to me at least, I think this makes it a fairly strong experiment. Well, no, I shouldn't say that, right? I should say that this makes it more of a robust finding across the entire population because it was just 50 random guy or people, right? There's, you know, just volunteers from a university. Yeah. Whereas I know you could possibly this effect might be bigger if we did pre-select our people. Like if you guys if you did this experiment, perhaps the effect would be huge. I don't know, right? But yeah, so that's the group of people I did. So it was 50-50. So there's about 100 people across both these studies. Yeah. Is there any other? Yeah.
I've got a question about consciousness.
Yeah.
Is consciousness dependent on the human body? I mean, if you didn't have a body, you'd be still conscious.
Super interesting question. I don't know. Like, well, so I mean, there's these beliefs, right? That like, for example, we could take our consciousness and we could transport it if we could only have a scanner good enough. We could scan every atom and every like molecule in our brain, and we could find out which position everything's in, and we could just translate that into a computer, and then we could be conscious. And there's one school of thought that says, oh yeah, that would be consciousness. And there's another school of thought that says that's not consciousness. There's no way you'd be conscious. It would be I think one of the phrases people use was a existential hell because you didn't have the body, you didn't have the embodiment of consciousness.
So radio and television signals existing, whether televisions or radios exist. I mean, that's the only reason we have
Is
awareness
a receptor, right?
receptors because we have a television or radio.
Yeah.
But if we didn't have one, those signals still exist.
Totally fair. Totally. No, I mean, totally fair. It's possible that there is consciousness outside of humanity, right? That's a yeah. But yeah, I mean, look, yeah, so I mean, yeah, the whole like quantum, like, oh, nothing exists until consciousness is this. Yeah. I mean, there's like if you guys have heard of panpsychism, there's panpsychism, which is the idea that everything is conscious. I don't know. Which is wild to me, right? Because pan what? Panentheism. Okay, cool. There you go. Yeah. Yeah, again, it's not so yeah, the consciousness I study, the stuff we are involved in is like it's called IIT. So it's integrated information theory. And the idea behind it is that what consciousness is the amount of information held beyond the actual physical substrate of the like the whatever it is. Like it doesn't actually matter what it is. It could be a rock, right? So the complexity of how much information is held within this rock above and beyond what would be expected based on just like pairing every atom together. I personally don't like integrated information theory, specifically because it's a really fancy mathematical like formulation of consciousness that doesn't tell us anything. Like which is my problem with a lot of academia. It's a lot of fancy graphs, it's a lot of fancy pictures, and it doesn't say anything. Yeah. Whereas this, I think, says, this to me at least says a lot. Yeah. What's up?
Yeah, one of
What's what?
was demand effects that, I think somebody I read said, well, he just believed that the experiment, he just believed that the experiment would work. So, you know,
How is that a criticism?
yeah.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
was going to ask you,
What did I believe?
yeah, what did you believe before the experiment? Did
Well,
you think?
I Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, so I was wondering where you're going because I was like, that sounds like a ridiculous criticism. How can you say parapsychology isn't real based on you thinking that parapsychology is real? Like that's um uh I I don't know if I thought it was gonna work or not. I mean, I'd done the first two studies and I was like, oh, this didn't work. And then the next like yeah, I guess 7. I was like, oh, I yeah, this kind of came in with a very, I guess, a very open mind. I should say. I didn't like say, oh yeah, it's definitely gonna work, or oh, it's definitely not gonna work. I just wanted to know. I just wanted to try things out and see what happened, right? Yeah.
A follow-up question.
Hmm.
It kind of seems like going through and looking at a lot of these that demand effects are actually not the key things that cause a lot of this phenomenon to work.
Yeah.
It would be interesting to actually see an experiment where you got a whole bunch of people
That are,
then induce the belief that it was going to work
yeah.
in the different conditions and see if that would actually have an effect on the experiment. Because a lot of the previous stuff that was done in the Ossophy and all the previous stuff that actually had psychologists doing some
Yeah.
experiments, demand effects was the core of whether a phenomenon actually worked or not.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just interested
That's
because
yeah,
normally
yeah.
we would control and take that out.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Actually, it may be.
And I think that's totally legitimate. I think that's totally fair, right? Like, I mean, in cognitive science, at least, the way we do research is to try to remove the researcher as much as possible, as much as possible, as much as possible. But then that's it's kind of bogus. Oh, sorry. It's kind of bogus, right? Because we we're always involved in our experiments. Even like I wrote the instructions for the experiments, and by writing those instructions, I had already influenced the outcome of that experiment without even thinking about it, right? Without even consciously going in and saying, oh, I'm going to manipulate it this way and things like that. And the fact that mainstream psychology or cognitive science doesn't think like that is nonsense to me. Like how they can possibly believe that they're not influencing anything is absolutely wild. I'll tell you what, I'll get back to the questions in 2 seconds. I was just going to say what I thought was what this meant, right? Was first I mentioned that there was a reversal in the left hand. So the right hand, you had this effect, right? This retrocausal effect. Uh, and yeah, so that was evidence of retrocausation to me. So I guess my question was that whether this had something to do with yeah, so you know our the right hand of our brain, or the right hand is kind of just the left side of our brain, um which is interesting to me because I would have thought that if anything it'd be the other way around, whereas because the right side, so the left side is involved with things like speech, for example, right, whereas the right side of the brain is much more, I mean, classically I guess thought of as intuition. But having said that, I don't know, I did speech pathology for a number of years, which probably biased my thinking. I think, you know, we kind of need our whole brain for most things we do in life, right? Our brain's pretty important, which we'll learn about next, I'm sure, right? Our brains. Now you're like, oh no, our brain's not important. Okay. Oh, good. All right, it's good to know. Yeah. But yeah, I that fits, and this finding kind of fit with intuition, or at least my intuition of feeling of what is going to happen rather than when or where or whether something is going to happen. Yeah, and then I did mention the ASGS there. So future directions, some things that I would like to see uh, happen, I guess, in the future of this kind of field is like I really like my studies. I think they're very good parameterizations of the phenomenon, right? But like you're saying, with it being dependent upon the mindset of the researcher, you know, I it's hard to control for, right? But you know, I mean, at the end of the day, I mean, you guys are all here because you don't necessarily think that we need to control for everything. And I think that's totally fair. That's totally valid. Why do we need to control every aspect of life? You know, this was kind of one of the things I took away from your talk, that, you know, it's life is kind of beautiful, you know, it's kind of beautiful, and it's in the way it's, you know, that it's messy. We don't need to control for every aspect, and that I can find an effect here. I mean, that's pretty cool. That's pretty cool, you know. So some things I would like to see, some more EEG or fMRI studies. I know I last time I talked to Bierman, he was talking about doing some EEG experiments for retrocausation. That's the measuring of the brain waves. So neuromodulation, which we talked about briefly before, I think, especially if there's a handedness effect in this last experiment, you know, you could take this and you can reduce the ability of the brain to do certain things, right? Like, for example, I can use TMS to reduce sensitivity of the like one part of the brain to stimulus, right? So I might be able to exaggerate this effect. Um, Having said that, right, that the way I'm talking assumes that all of this is necessarily in our brain, right? Which is also I'm totally open to it not being. Maybe it's not. Maybe it's totally something different, right? Um, and then yeah, I guess this other so it's pharmaceutical interventions as well to change conscious state and see how that affects would be interesting. I guess one little side note of a criticism, or when I was looking at some studies for this, I came across this study, which is about EEG frequencies. So when you measure EEG, you get a time series, and you can decompose that time series into um, into like frequency bands. So activity in different like 5 hertz, 10 hertz, whatever, right? And what the study did was they took people who believed in parapsychology and they said, hey, look, they have higher activity in these frequency bands, and that's associated with ADHD, inhibitory control problems. And that's I keep saying this word. I'm sorry, buddy. Bullshit. That is nonsense. That's not how EEG works. The way these guys are using EEG to confirm their own beliefs is exactly what they accuse parapsychologists of, and I hate it. I really have a problem with how mainstream society or mainstream science thinks it's better than thou, and it does the exact same things that it accuses parapsychology researchers of doing. Right. So, yeah, I guess on that note, I guess, with me being discontent with general cognitive science. Yeah, if there's any questions, yeah, like, yeah,
Thank you very much. Very interesting talk. You touched on doing experiments using EEG.
yeah,
So you haven't moved to that stage where we have 50 people in the lab wired up with galvanic response to EEG, because with you could do a thing like a P300
yeah,
where they don't even need to press the button.
yeah,
And another layout I wanted to ask you, you made a comment about using banal type of images and shapes,
yeah,
things that are not emotional.
yeah.
There's been experiments in the past where
They
some
have
very strong images have been displayed.
definitely.
If you can comment on that too.
Well, so I mean, the very strong images, from what I remember, the BEM studies, right? It was fairly like I guess pornographic, was it pornographic images, something like that. And I like, to be fair, that's probably legitimate. I did a study when I was in university. It wasn't my study. I was participating in somebody else's study where they used very like what would you call it, like not even profane, but like morally inappropriate, what we consider as society as morally inappropriate kind of like sentences, right? And then the idea was that they wanted to see how our eyes react. Like they used, it's called pupillometry, where they measure the diameter of the pupil, right? And they were looking for whether these kind of things affect our arousal levels, right? Which is, and I think that's a fair method of research, and I think indeed in BEM's study, I think that would also be a fair method of research. It's just I wanted to take it really. Yeah, banal. I just wanted to take it super, super boring to the point that like if you ever have done one of my studies, I hope none of you have. I apologize. They're incredibly boring. It's like half an hour of just pushing A and B. As far as the P300, I think that's a reasonable thing. One of the things I look at is the P300 is after the way I use it anyways is after a surprising stimulus, you'll get a larger positive deflection in the electrical activity coming off of your brain 300 milliseconds after that stimulus, right? So they do something called an oddball task where it's like blink, 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 and that high pitched blink will get something called the P300. I also look at the what it's called, the mismatch activity, which is about 200 milliseconds after the stimulus, you get a big negative going wave as well, which I think that's, it's a totally fair thing to look at. I think that'd be, interesting, you know.
Hi, I'm not a scientific person at all, so a lot of that
I'm sorry.
but you're obviously very passionate about it, to be part of it, of the parascientific or psychology area. And just recently, I don't know if you've ever heard of Dr. Joe Dispenza, but he's doing loads of like he's doing science with Harvard and stuff too.
Wow.
Actually, prove all this stuff. So I just wanted
That's
to.
I haven't heard about it. What was his name? Joan Spencer. Okay, we're gonna write that down. Yeah.
Um,
Oh, you want to write it up there? That'd be helpful. Yeah.
yeah, because I know it's been like the space for me in my work, and I've done over the last 10 years. It's like that scientific piece or unable to
Yeah.
put in, but like what he has done in terms of experimenting with the EEGs and all
Yeah.
of these things, like hundreds of people in the same room.
That's fantastic.
So I just
Oh, that's
open that door to
Thank you,
because I think
thank
you
you.
really love it.
Oh man, I do. I really enjoy that. Like people, and it does seem, actually we were talking about beforehand that, in the next 10 years that this is really going to expand. People, I think, as a testament, like when I came to this, I was like, oh yeah, it'll be me talking to, 10 people or whatever. And look at this, it's a room full of people that are interested in this area of research, which is fantastic to see. So hopefully it'll keep growing.
To what you're saying. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's actually a question too. A lot of the self-development gurus talk about if you want something, you just write it down and then you feel as if you've already got it and then you forget about it. Is that something that we can use is that an application of
It could
his
be.
theory?
Yeah, it could be.
Then you should manifest.
Yeah. So the idea being that the idea being that it has manifest in the future, and therefore it's kind of influencing the way we act in the present. That's totally fair, right? So my difficulty with the application of this stuff, because I think that sounds like a totally legitimate application of the idea, right? Is how we can like influence it ourselves all the time. So if it's already going to be achieved and that affects how we behave now, then it's already going to happen, right? But I mean, then you come into like problems like determinism, and it gets really heavy and I don't know, somewhat depressing to me at least. I'm like, oh man, determinism. So but yeah, no, I think that's totally legitimate. Yeah.
I think too, just also I noticed on one of your slides, you talked about psychedelics as well, as part of that. He also, well, I know he's inspired me to be able to create that same chemical reaction without actually using substance.
Yeah.
I actually experienced this last week or moment.
Oh,
So it's like,
nice. Is that like a DMT-ish kind of experience or like I mean like the chemical release is no.
to create that in your body.
Yeah. Wow.
From meditate.
Man, that'd be, yeah. Like, I think that would be super interesting to like when I hear things like that, I'm like, yeah, exactly, man. Yeah.
The done.
Yeah. That'd be super. Like whenever I hear things like that, I'm like, oh, my scientific curiosity is perked. I'd love to do like, I mean, I don't know. I'm kind of of two minds of it, right? Because on the one hand, I'd be like, oh man, I would love to like just do a little pinprick and get the blood and like look what's going on in the blood there. But at the same time, uh, I think that would negatively impact your experience, right? Like being in a hospital setting and having to get your blood drawn and things like that. And B, I don't even really know if we need to do that, right? Like it's like the drive, at least in West. I had this, not this talk, but a similar talk to my cognitive science students at Macquarie, where I basically just tried to turn them off of being cognitive science students. I was like, the whole system is broken. You're not going to get funding for this. Like, whatever you want to do, forget about it because you're never going to be able to get research funding for it. So, and like, I kind of went down that same alley where it's like, at some point, yeah, it's fine to just be. It's all right, Yeah. Cool. Yeah.
I just was wondering if you can use some groups like I'd like to see between groups like those who are suggestible or hypnotizable or very creative
Yeah.
and those who aren't. So maybe the Rosberg one.
I would love to. It's increasingly so. I mean, here's a look inside academia for you all. I'm at UCID now, so I was in Macquarie, and when I was in Macquarie, I was part of the, I guess, psychology department, and I had access to students. Now I'm at UCID. I'm part of the medical science faculty, and I can get ethics clearance to do studies there, but then they're like, oh, you can't use any of our students. What? So it's really nonsense. It really irritates me. Like to the point that like I had submitted an ethics application and then they told me that and I was like, if anybody's ever tried to do an ethics application, it's really tedious because you get a bunch of people telling you that everything you're doing is unethical, which is wild. Like experiments like this have no effect on people, right? Like they're just pushing a button for half an hour. The worst is that they get bored, right? But they're like, oh, what if it affects people negatively? Oh, you're paying them. Is that coercive or things like that? I'm like, oh man, so I just threw up my hands basically, you know. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, was there yeah, behind you?
Cheers. Thanks for the talk there. Just some of your graphs
Mhm.
for me appeared to show quite stronger significant differences. In your analyses, did any of your p-values approach significance?
I would have to double check. So are you talking about like this side here? So this side here is the standard version. This is like the non-retrocausal version where I would show the cue first. So with a lot of, I should have said this, I should have made this clear, but with a lot of the experiments, I did the standard version first and then the retrocausal version, right? So the idea was that I wanted to get them used to the task and then have them do the retrocausal version. Now, I will say that I think that might have been a problem as well, right? Because maybe by doing the standard task first, I don't know, for example, maybe it adhered them to the past rather than the future. For example, it made them think, oh, this is where the cue is coming from, right? Now, for a couple of experiments, I didn't. I cut out the standard task, and I think it was actually one of the go no go ones, which I still didn't find an effect, but still, it is entirely possible that maybe by showing the standard version, I did influence the results. So it's yeah, great observation. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Does that make sense as far as the answer?
I wouldn't want to see the thing
So I mean, for these on the retrocausations one, I mean, I might be able to find it really quick. I was actually Lance, I just resubmitted a new version of our article, so it should get accepted this time. They were just asking for like a permutation test as opposed to like a standard ANOVA, which is fair. So actually one other thing which might maybe of interest to you guys is that to get this second study published, I had to use all non-parametric research studies or statistical methods. Non-parametric is like assuming that there's no, it doesn't make the assumption that everything is normally distributed, which is totally legitimate, right? Because reaction times actually are not normally distributed, right? So reaction times generally don't look like this. They don't look like this. They look like that, right? So you have a lot of fast reaction times and a lot more slow reaction times. But the interesting thing to me was that I have published multiple standard experiments and they've never asked me to do that. Just for the retrocausal experiment, they're like, oh, you better use non-parametric stats. Let's see, submission 1, and there you go. So a sneak preview of the upcoming. Let's see. Actually, it actually might be kind of hard to see and kind of tedious for you guys. But if you ask me afterwards, I can, or if you send me an email or something, I can send you the paper as well. I did, I think, put up my email here, which was just my name at sydney.edu.au. Great. All right. Thank you very much for having me, guys. It's been a real pleasure. So thank you. Oh, sorry. Thank you.